Oh yeah, it looks like Caitlin Clark has officially won the power struggle versus Stephanie White, at least for now. At least for now. We have a good enough sample size.
Stephanie White made a decision, a big one. She looked at her roster, looked at her system, and decided she knew better than the moment she was standing in. Coaches do that sometimes. They trust the plan over the player, the scheme over the spark, the clipboard over the court. But here's the thing about Caitlin Clark. She doesn't care about your plan. She never has. She just dismantles it piece by piece, possession by possession, until the plan isn't even recognizable anymore. Quietly at first, then all at once. And then it's over before you even realized it started falling apart. And now, with the scoreboard telling a story White didn't write and clearly didn't see coming, the question isn't whether the strategy failed. That part is already settled. The real question is whether White can survive what comes next, both professionally and inside that locker room. Because in the WNBA, momentum is currency. And right now, Clark is printing money while White's account is running empty. The fallout from this isn't just a bad game or a rough stretch. It might be the turning point that defines her entire coaching tenure in Indiana. And you need to see exactly how it unraveled, because the details are what make this situation so completely damning. You're probably already asking yourself what exactly White did that backfired so completely and so publicly. Was it a lineup call she refused to walk back? A defensive scheme she kept running even when it clearly wasn't working? Or something she said in the media that aged about as well as milk left out in July? That's where most people start, and honestly, that alone is worth understanding. But then, the next question starts forming almost immediately. Why does it feel like every single time someone builds a specific game plan to contain Clark, she responds by playing the best and most aggressive basketball of her entire career? It's starting to feel less like coincidence and more like something deeply personal. Then something heavier starts to nag at you. Did White actually have a real answer for Clark? Or was she quietly hoping the defining moment wouldn't fully arrive on her watch? Because it arrived. It arrived loud, and it arrived early, and it didn't leave. And then the question that really stings starts creeping in slowly. Is this a one-game correction, or is it hard evidence that White's entire coaching philosophy was simply never built to coexist with a generational talent like Caitlin Clark? That last question deserves more than a quick answer. This video is going to break every layer of this down for you with no fluff, no filler, and no hot takes manufactured purely for clicks. You are going to understand exactly what decision Stephanie White made, why she made it, and why it collapsed so completely under the weight of the moment when it mattered most. You are going to see the specific plays, the specific possessions, where Clark didn't just beat the defense, but actively expose the philosophy and the thinking behind it, which is an entirely different and far more dangerous thing for a coaching staff to deal with. You will also walk away with a genuinely clear read on whether the conversation building around White's job security is a real and legitimate organizational concern being discussed behind closed doors, or just noise being generated by people reacting emotionally to one bad night. And we are going deeper into something that most coverage is completely skipping over right now, which is how Clark's continued rise is quietly but very forcefully reshaping the internal power structure and the identity of this entire franchise from the inside out. This video goes to places the box score and the highlights will never take you. But before we dive into all of it, do you actually believe Stephanie White is the right coach to build a legitimate championship contender around Caitlin Clark long-term? Let me know in the comments below. A 5-5 start with Caitlin Clark on your roster is not a slow burn. It is a 5-alarm fire with nobody pulling the hose. Getting blown out by Portland and dropping a game to the Valkyries while running an offense that looked like it was designed in 2009 is not growing pains. That is a coaching staff refusing to read the room. The Indiana Fever had the most electrifying offensive talent in the entire league sitting right in front of them and somehow built a system that reduced her to a spectator, while Kelsey Mitchell ran isolation after isolation into a brick wall. That is not basketball. That is ego wearing a clipboard. And the switching 1 through 5 strategy on Clark was not some calculated defensive counter. It was panic repackaged as philosophy, and real basketball minds spotted it failing before the ink on the scouting report was even dry. The part that should genuinely disturb you is that none of this was hidden. It was happening in plain sight, in real time, every single game, which means the people making these decisions were either completely blind to it or fully aware and simply did not care enough to change course. When your franchise player is Caitlin Clark, neither of those explanations is remotely acceptable.
A huge power struggle, as it seems, in terms of play style between what Caitlin Clark wants to do and what Stephanie White wants to do. And let's just say throughout the first 10 games of the season, the Indiana Fever looked like an unmitigated disaster. The offense was putrid. It was stagnant. It was the Kelsey Mitchell show. It was bad basketball, and it led the Indiana Fever to being a 500 team that looked like they needed to blow it up. Let's just be clear. They were 5-5. You got blown out versus the Portland Fire. Okay, you lost to the Valkyries, and that's when the ISO on Caitlin started. That's when everybody started talking about how Stephanie White is switching 1 through 5, and it's really stupid. We all said it.
You probably heard all of that, and your first instinct was to ask how a team built around Clark even arrived at 5-5 to begin with. That question makes complete sense, and it is the right place to start. But right behind it comes something sharper. If the offense was this stagnant and this predictable night after night, what was actually being installed in practice every single day before tip-off, then something starts to genuinely bother you on a deeper level. Was the Kelsey Mitchell heavy approach a legitimate strategic decision, or was it Stephanie White quietly sending a message that her system was not going to be rebuilt around Clark no matter how obvious that rebuild needed to be? And that pulls you somewhere even more uncomfortable. If fans, players, and outside voices all flagged the switching 1 through 5 problem before it exploded publicly, why did it take external pressure to even start the conversation internally? Then the biggest question of all lands right on top of everything else. Is Stephanie White actually capable of evolving her philosophy mid-season under pressure, or does she only move when the walls are already caving in around her? The honest answer is that the 5-5 start had nothing to do with bad luck or a roster finding its rhythm. It was the direct and predictable result of a coaching staff that arrived with a system and treated that system as untouchable, regardless of what the games were revealing. Kelsey Mitchell is a real player and a genuine contributor. She is not and never was the offensive centerpiece of a team that has Caitlin Clark in the backcourt. Running the offense through her while Clark drifted off the ball was never a development phase. It was a quiet power struggle being played out through play calling, and Clark's production was making that struggle increasingly impossible for White to win in the public eye. The switching 1 through 5 coverage became the most talked about flashpoint because it was the most visible and the most obviously flawed, but the dysfunction ran far deeper than one defensive adjustment. That was just the surface. What sits underneath it is where this whole situation gets genuinely complicated, and the next piece of evidence reframes everything you just heard in a way that makes this far bigger than one bad stretch of games. There is a pattern here, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. This is the second time in Caitlin Clark's young WNBA career that a head coach has had to publicly walk back their own system because it was visibly and embarrassingly failing around her. Christy Sides tried it first. Long twos, Erica Wheeler controlling the ball, Clark standing in the corner like a paid spectator at her own show while the offense sputtered and stalled every single possession. That experiment ended the only way it could, with the coach conceding ground and Clark finally being unleashed to do what she does naturally. Now Stephanie White is watching that exact same script play out on her sideline in real time and somehow still needed 10 full games and a nationally embarrassing performance from Kelsey Mitchell to begin making even the most basic adjustments. The Washington Mystics game was not a tactical evolution or some breakthrough moment of coaching clarity. It was a forced surrender dressed up as a game plan. The win was real, and the Fever needed it desperately, but the reason that win became possible at all is the part that should be making Stephanie White extremely uncomfortable every single morning she walks into that facility.
Said anything. It looks like Stephanie White is finally being forced to concede to Caitlin Clark's style of play after a brutal first 10 games. And there's still been some pushback, but I think Caitlin Clark mapped this thing out perfectly. When you think about what happened in her rookie year with Christy Sides, Christy Sides is talking about she needs to take long twos, all of this stuff, a bunch of nonsense. You got Erica Wheeler holding the ball. You got Kelsey Mitchell holding the ball. Caitlin Clark standing off in the corner. It wasn't working. Christy Sides had to concede to Caitlin Clark's style, and boom, everything started changing. And what do you know if you look at what's going on right now? Indiana Fever started out 5-5 with a brutal loss to the New York Liberty, which Kelsey Mitchell was flat out embarrassing in. She was ball hogging. She refused to pass the ball. She was playing circus act basketball. And ever since then, you go to the Washington Mystics game, and Caitlin Clark bails out the team. And I saw the ball in Caitlin's hands a little bit more, not as much as we would like, but
you probably clocked the Christy Sides comparison immediately and felt something click into place in a way that is equal parts satisfying and deeply frustrating. But the question that follows is the one that actually carries real weight. If this exact situation already played out during Clark's rookie season and ended with the coach being completely overruled by reality, why did Stephanie White not study that history and build her entire offensive philosophy around it before a single preseason game was even played? That is not a minor oversight. That is a fundamental failure of preparation. Then you start wondering whether the Kelsey Mitchell ball dominance was ever genuinely a scheme decision, or whether it was something far messier underneath, something rooted in locker room politics and veteran entitlement that White either could not or simply refused to confront head-on. And then the broader question starts to surface slowly. If Clark is essentially forcing coaching changes for the second consecutive season of her career, what does that tell you about the organizational culture and the power dynamics operating around her? Then the question you almost do not want to say out loud arrives. Is Caitlin Clark being quietly and systematically undermined by the very people who are supposed to be constructing everything around her success? The Christy Sides parallel is not a coincidence, and it is not an overreaction to connect those dots. It is a pattern, and patterns in professional sports tell you everything about organizational culture, roster management, and the kind of decision-making happening behind closed doors. Both coaches arrived with established systems. Both coaches structurally deprioritized Clark's greatest strengths in favor of those systems. Both coaches eventually had no choice but to abandon those systems entirely when the losses became too loud and too public to absorb any longer. The difference this time around is that the stakes are significantly higher, the national spotlight is significantly brighter, and Clark is no longer a quiet rookie absorbing dysfunction while learning the professional game. She is a proven and undeniable commodity who bailed her team out against Washington not because the system suddenly worked, but because she was finally given enough freedom to operate completely outside of it. That is one of the most damning things you can say about any head coach's season. White got her win, but she got it entirely on Clark's terms and not her own. What comes next in this story pulls back the curtain even further on just how deep and how personal this tension runs inside the Indiana Fever organization. And it involves a voice that nobody in that building was expecting to enter the conversation. 3-0. Let that number sit for a second. When the Indiana Fever play Caitlin Clark's style of basketball, they win every single time so far. When they played Stephanie White's style, they went 5-5 and looked like a team that needed to be completely dismantled. That is not a small sample size argument anymore. That is a verdict. The Chicago Sky game with Clark running the offense produced a historic first. 2 players dropping 30-point double-doubles in the same WNBA game. The Connecticut Sun game saw Clark score 25 points without a single free throw, which means she was doing all of that damage in the flow of the offense rather than drawing fouls, and the Fever won that one too. The pick-and-roll combination between Clark and Aaliyah Boston is not just working. It is proving to be genuinely unguardable in this league. And now the real question is whether Stephanie White has the self-awareness and the professional honesty to accept what these 3 games have already proven beyond any reasonable debate.
Clark had the ball in her hand pretty much exclusively. Her and Aaliyah Boston go for 30-point double-doubles, the first tandem in WNBA history to do that. The Indiana Fever win. What happened versus the Connecticut Sun? The ball was mostly in Caitlin Clark's hands. She scores 25 points, not a single free throw. Had 5 assists, should have been 13, 14 assists if Aaliyah Boston and Lexi Hall need some of these players can make layups. But she scores 25 points with no free throws, and the Indiana Fever win. As far as I'm concerned, the Indiana Fever are 3-0 playing Caitlin Clark's style of basketball, and they are 5-5 while they were trying to play Stephanie White's style. Caitlin Clark has won the power struggle, at least for now. Oh, I think we're 3-0 playing my way. We can't go back to playing your way. What have the Indiana Fever been doing? Pick and roll.
You are probably sitting with that 3-0 stat and feeling something between vindication and frustration, because this should not have taken 10 games of dysfunction to figure out. The first question that surfaces is obvious. If Clark running the offense produces wins this consistently and this convincingly, why was there ever a legitimate debate about who should be controlling the ball? Then something sharper follows. What does it say about Stephanie White's coaching instincts that the most unstoppable 2-man action in the entire WNBA was sitting right in front of her the whole time, and she chose Kelsey Mitchell isolation basketball instead? Then you start thinking about the bigger picture. If the Fever are this dangerous when Clark is unleashed, how many wins did this team leave on the table during that 5-5 stretch? And the question underneath all of that is the one that genuinely stings. How long before White reverts? Because coaches with stubborn systems almost always do. 3-0 is not luck, and it is not a hot streak finding its timing. It is proof of concept delivered in the clearest possible language. The Clark and Boston pick and roll is functionally broken for opposing defenses in this league right now, because there is no clean answer for it. You hedge on Clark and Boston scores. You lock onto Boston, and Clark pulls up from wherever she wants. It is a 2-option equation with no good solution, and it took Stephanie White 10 losses and public pressure to deploy it consistently. The wins are coming now, but the cost of those first 10 games in terms of standings, confidence, and internal trust is not nothing. It is a debt the coaching staff created, and Clark is the one paying it off. What makes everything you just heard even more significant is that there are voices inside and outside that locker room who have now decided they are done staying quiet about it.